Welcome to the REI Hacker Podcast, where we unlock the secrets of real estate success. Join us as we dive into the journeys of top investors, mentors, and industry experts. And now, let's hand it off to our host, Benson Juarez.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here on this edition of the REI Hacker Podcast. Really excited for my next guest. His name is Bob Bluhm. Bob is one of the nation's leading asset protection lawyers. In over 30 years as an attorney, Bob has been a trial lawyer. He's represented Fortune 500 companies as well as smaller privately held businesses. Bob specializes in protecting real estate investors and other business owners from lawsuits, lowering their taxes, and reducing their risk of an IRS audit. Bob and his team have helped thousands of people all over the world grow their wealth more quickly and securely. Bob, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Great to be with you, Benson. Happy to do so.
Yeah, so you've been in the business for a long time, and you've done lots of different, I guess, what you would call verticals inside, the lawyer world. But you started off as a litigation attorney.
I did.
Right, and you worked for some pretty large companies. Tell me about how you got started in the business and how did you end up doing more like wealth protection than representing people in court cases?
It's a little bit of a long story, but I'll try to make it short. The bottom line was I was a litigation attorney, a trial lawyer representing people, companies, and I got a case that was a company that you'd all recognize. It was a client, and they had fired some guys because of their age. And that's age discrimination. Can't do that. So my client was wrong. But every client, whether they're right or wrong, deserves their day in court, and they deserve the best defense that they can have. And so we were in court, and the facts were bad. They weren't against us. The law was against us. But at trial, the plaintiff's lawyer made a serious mistake, and I capitalized on that mistake, and we won the case. Now, we shouldn't have won the case, but we did. And normally when you win, you're just celebrating because you've worked on this case for a couple of years, evenings and weekends, and lived and breathed, the case. But this was really different because often when you're in litigation, it's one company suing another company and the loser writes a check and life goes on. But this time, these were people that had lost their jobs, they had lost their income, they had lost their pensions, they had lost virtually everything, and they were never going to get another job at their pay level again because of their age. And so these guys were suing to get back wages and get their jobs back, and we won and prevented them from doing that, and it really hurt those guys. As I left the courtroom, I saw them, weeping with their families. We're ruined. We're going to lose our home. We can't do this. And I just said to myself, this was wrong. We shouldn't have won the case. And it just left such a bad taste in my mouth that I said, I'm just not going to do this anymore. I didn't go into law to hurt people. I went into law to help people. So I took everything I had learned about courtrooms, trials, suing people, lawsuits, and I took it 180 degrees around and now use that information and knowledge to protect people from lawyers like I used to be. So that's how I became an asset protection lawyer. And, asset protection is great because it gives people peace of mind, financial security, and freedom from fear. So it's a much more satisfying field for me to be in.
Well, and it just goes to prove how important representation is and choosing the right lawyers, right? Because it sounded like, you shouldn't have won the case, right? The evidence was against you, but because their lawyer made a mistake and, maybe didn't follow procedure or said something they shouldn't have, you still won. And I don't know that a lot of people understand that. Like, people always get down on attorneys because they make so much money. Right? They call them ambulance chasers and all this, and that's a different world. But a good attorney is worth their weight in gold if it's leveraged properly, right?
Absolutely right. Going to trial is a 50-50 proposition. You have no idea what's going to happen in trial, even though you've got the law on your side, the facts on your side. You feel like we're going to win this case. You never know. And that's why so many cases also settle, because they just don't want to take the risk, even though they've prepared, they know exactly how their witnesses are all prepared. They still will often settle on the courthouse steps right before the trial begins because they just don't want to take that risk of the unknown and how a jury is going to view the evidence and or how a judge will rule. So it's risky going to trial, and it's something to avoid if you can at all. And that's what I do, is I help people avoid lawsuits. I minimize their risk and think through, how do we stay out of court?
Oh yeah. And then there's that whole side of the business, which is like evaluating the team you're up against.
Mhm.
So if you're going up against a newer attorney or somebody who has a bad track record, and even if you think you don't have the evidence on your side, you might tell your client, listen, that attorney doesn't know what they're doing. Like, I think we can beat them if we just position this right.
Mhm.
And then you're thinking about, okay, what can we dig up on the plaintiffs or the defendants? Either way, right? Like,
Mhm.
what can we dig up on them that's gonna, make them look bad, like they're not credible. So there's a whole game to it. I mean, it's very interesting.
There really is. And here's where asset protection intersects sort of with trials,
Hmm.
because when you have an LLC or a corporation or a limited partnership, you want the court to view that as a real business. In other words, did you take your LLC seriously? And the way you prove that you did is because you will have financial records, you'll have profit and loss statements, you'll have bookkeeping done, you'll have minutes and resolutions, you will have full documentation. And that's the mistake that a lot of people make, is they think, well, I'm just going to go on some online service and I'm going to set up an LLC, and they, give it very little thought and they set it up. And, that is not going to impress a judge. I've seen operating agreements that people got off the internet with fill in the blank lines, and the lines haven't even been filled in. They think that's their operating agreement, and that just is not going to fly in court, because the judge is going to look down on that and say, what? Look, if you didn't take your LLC seriously, why should this court? And they
Right.
will pierce the corporate veil. And what that means is they will disregard the existence of the LLC altogether, and they will go after your personal assets to satisfy the judgment. So that's the real risk that people run in setting up their own LLC. It's a real problem.
Right. Because it really is more of an art than it is a science, because you have to understand what kind of business that you're in. And there's a right way and a wrong way to set up an LLC for different kinds of businesses.
Mhm.
Also, like, what state do you operate out of, right? Are you doing business in another state where you have to have a foreign filing? Like, all that
Mhm.
stuff can complicate it and muddy the waters. And the average business owner, and if someone's just starting an LLC for the first time, normally this is their first rodeo.
Mhm.
They just don't know what they don't know, right? Now,
That's
maybe
right.
they've been around for a while, and they're just starting the next business, which is possible too. But in that case, maybe they know better. But it's really the newer people who should be most conscious about setting it up properly and really looking for the right representation or company that can help them set it up so they don't get themselves into trouble down the line. Because
You're so right.
the chances of something happening are unlikely, but that's the whole point of this. It's almost like an insurance policy.
Mhm. Yeah, it's unlikely your house is going to burn down, but you still have fire insurance.
Right.
Yeah.
And, you know, we should learn from others' mistakes, right? And, especially in a world now where it's so litigious, there's a whole shops out there of lawyers that they're just looking for people to take advantage of.
Hmm.
Their whole job is to find, okay, who probably doesn't have their stuff buttoned up. Right, let's go after them. Right? That's their jobs.
That's absolutely true. And I'll give you a concrete example of that. And the Americans with Disability Act requires that a website, for example, has to be accessible to people who are vision impaired or have other impairments. And there are law firms, believe it or not, that do nothing but check website after website after website. And when they find websites that are not ADA compliant, they immediately file a lawsuit against them. And so you're right. I mean, that is something that happens all the time.
Wow.
Yeah.
What's another example of that maybe people don't know about? Because I didn't know that was a thing that people were doing, and I figured there was something out there that lawyers were looking for. But that ADA thing, probably 90% of websites don't have that ADA compliance in place, right?
Yeah, many don't. But if you had your website set up, professionally, it will be compliant. Another example is, the do not call list, for example, or texting. There's the Telephone Act that says that if you are texting people without their permission, you can be fined, you can be sued. And that's another example. So there are law firms that just search through that. They even set themselves up to see if they're going to get texts that they are, maybe they're on the do not call list, and yet they get called, they get texts. And that's another way that lawyers will kind of search for people to sue.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
And we think that lawyers are there, right? They're non-biased and they're there to protect us, right? Unless you're being sued, right? But it could be further from the truth. It's just an occupation where they can basically create their own business.
Well, yes. Yeah, that is true. And there are plaintiffs lawyers who operate that way. There are plenty of good plaintiffs lawyers who will not take a case because they would consider it unethical, or they're just not going to take that case. Plenty of good plaintiffs lawyers, but then again, there are always those that will just look for people to sue. And you're right, it is a business proposition. So you do want to have good legal representation. You want to have a lawyer look over what you're doing. You want to make sure that you're, complying with state and federal and local laws.
Yeah. So let's talk about the basics.
Yeah, I was going to say, Benson, there are so many state, local, and federal laws that, if you're not aware of what those are, you may need a business license in your area. If you're operating an Airbnb, more and more localities are requiring that you have a business license to operate an Airbnb. I mean, that's not across the board, but because this is kind of, Airbnbs are relatively new, localities are adapting, and some are requiring a business license. So if you didn't, if you're an Airbnb operator, you didn't know about that, well, now you're not in compliance. You're subject to be fined or possibly even sued.
Yeah. So there's asset protection, right? Which is, okay, we want to make sure that we're protecting ourselves from litigation by putting up this wall, right? This LLC, this corporate entity that can protect the individual from liability, right? That's one of the purposes of having an LLC.
That's right.
But there's a lot that goes to that, right? You can't, like you said, don't just go to some website and form a general LLC. What are the proper steps that somebody who's forming a new company should follow so they're protected in the future?
There really are a lot of important steps to really consider, and an attorney can help you through, what are the pros and cons of making this choice over another choice. Let me give you a few examples. What is the LLC supposed to do? In other words, is it supposed to own assets and protect assets, or is it more of an operating company? Is it a holding company? Is it an IRA LLC of some kind? In other words, an LLC that has as its member the IRA. There are about 25 different LLCs that I've identified, different kinds of LLCs, all requiring different ways they would be set up. Another example, besides what does the LLC do, how is it taxed? An LLC can be taxed one of four different ways. It could be taxed as an S corporation, a C corporation, a sole proprietorship, or as a partnership. What are the tax ramifications of each one of those? In other words, certain types of businesses should have one tax election. Other types of businesses should have a different tax election. So if you're not familiar with those, you should be asking someone who knows. Another thing is, should this be manager managed or member managed? And there are consequences. There are times when it should be definitely member managed. Other times it should be manager managed. Who should the members be? Should it be you? Should it be you and your spouse if you have one? Should it be you and a business partner? Should it be maybe include your kids? Should it be a trust that owns the LLC, or should it be another LLC that owns the LLC? That would be a holding company. So that's another consideration. Another consideration is what state. You mentioned earlier, what state should we set it up in? And that depends on where are you operating, where are the assets that the LLC may own, what state are those assets in? So the state law is going to be a consideration. And some states are very, very strong in protecting you, and other states are very weak in protecting you. So these are, some of the considerations. Is there protective language in the LLC operating agreement? In other words, in terms of distributing, I should say, profits, is it a mandatory distribution or a discretionary distribution clause? Is it a pro rata or a non-pro rata distribution? So these are all questions, and there are many, many more questions like this that should be considered when we're setting up an LLC or a corporation, for that matter, or any legal entity. We want to weigh the pros and cons of doing it this way versus another way, and really examine what's going to be of most benefit to you.
Right. And people typically go to an LLC because that's just what's most commonly talked about. But there's been a fad recently in people wanting to start trusts. I'm going to start a trust, right? And maybe not knowing what it means entirely, but thinking, oh, okay, it's anonymity and it's the benefits of an LLC. Can you talk about some of the main differences between the two and why you might choose one over the other?
Sure. Trusts can be very flexible. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of different types of trusts based on what they are asked to do. The type of trust that is often used in real estate is a land trust or a realty trust, and it's simply a trust that owns real estate, and that does provide anonymity. So for those who are looking for financial privacy, using a land trust is a very good thing. There are other types of trusts. There are personal privacy trusts. These are often used in a state that may require the name of the manager of an LLC. And if you don't want to identify yourself as a manager, you can create a trust that is the manager of the LLC. In some states will not allow that. So it's very dependent upon the individual state, and that's why, once again, you want to have good legal counsel to guide you through those things.
Right. And then there's the whole concept of, an organizational structure. So maybe you form an LLC, but then you have a holding company that manages that LLC. And then there's, let's say you owned real estate, right? So you got passive income, and then you have got a wholesaling company. So you got some active income. And so it can get fairly complicated in putting this whole structure together, but it has to be very well thought out. Otherwise you might leave some holes, right?
Well, you're exactly right, because, for example, wholesaling income is active income, as you mentioned, and active income is the same as W-2 income and would be subject to Social Security taxes, Medicare, Medicaid taxes. And when you own the business yourself, that can amount to 15.3% in taxes, often called self-employment tax. So we would want to isolate wholesaling activities in one LLC, not only for the tax reasons, but also for reasons of potential liability. And we would then want to separate that from rental income. So we want to have a separate LLC for our rental properties, because that produces passive income. Rental income is passive income, which is not subject to self-employment tax, also called Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid tax. So by thinking through what is the tax consequence, what is the liability consideration, we want to be able to minimize our risk by isolating certain activities in one entity as opposed to another.
Right.
So you're quite right. When we look at an overall structure, depending upon the person's assets, their activities, their goals, their future plans, we may have a management company, which is taxed a certain way. We may have a holding company. We may have then various LLCs, some of which might produce active income, others of which might produce passive income. And
Right.
then to make it even more fun, we can have a living trust, which would own the whole structure because the living trust then will avoid probate upon the second death. So there we are. Yep.
Yeah, it can get very, very complicated, which is why, you want somebody who's experienced to help you structure it and really think about all the different aspects and how they work together. Because
Mhm.
there's, you mentioned all the complexities of it, and it's very complicated.
There are complexities. And, one thing I should mention is I said the second death. No, probate occurs whenever anyone passes away, but there are estate taxes to consider, and that occurs at the second death in a couple. And so we have not only federal estate taxes, and we also have state inheritance taxes. 17 states still have some kind of an estate tax. And you could have as little as $3 or $4 million and still be subject to an estate tax on the state level. The federal estate tax exemption is much, much higher than that, but nevertheless, we don't know where it will be when any of us pass away. It goes up, down, depending upon which party's in power.
Right.
Hmm.
And so there's a new party in power right now, right?
Hmm.
So things have changed. What's the biggest change you've seen, or do you think will come because of the new administration?
Well, the tax cuts that became law in 2017 expire at the end of this year, unless they are renewed in some way. And so the taxes that we've enjoyed, very historically low tax rates and all kinds of great deductions, will go away unless Congress acts. And that one of the priorities of this new administration is to make those tax cuts permanent and to push the tax rates even lower. Just as an example, a corporation tax rates for a C corporation used to be 35%. They dropped to 21%. And this administration has talked about making it as low as 15%. So who knows? We'll see how the legislation goes.
Right. Yeah, because the administration has their initiatives, but Congress has to agree to it, right?
Correct. Right.
But it is a, similar ideological, pillar, right? With that the president is. So maybe they won't get as much pushback than if it was the other party controlling
Maybe,
Congress,
maybe not. You
right?
never know. It's kind of like making sausage. You never know what's what's going to go into that, what kind of
Yeah,
oil
you're
trading
right.
will happen. Yeah,
There's a
that's
lot
the
of,
process.
behind closed doors dealings
Hmm.
going on,
Hmm.
um, which is interesting. So let's talk about um, one of the things that was really a lot of people were talking about, especially before the end of the year, and then there was the back and forth with the Corporate Transparency Act. Where does that stand right now? Like there was so much confusion about it, and there was like this big rush to go file the BOI. Is that what it was called?
That's right. That's
Um,
right.
and then people were like, "Oh, it's off, it's on, it's off," and people are like, "Fine, I'll just deal with it later." Like, what's going on with that?
Oh, it's a mess. It is the biggest mess. The it's called the Corporate Transparency Act, and the previous administration liked to say, well, it was a bipartisan act. Well, the reality is it was slipped in at the 11th hour into a defense reauthorization bill, which Trump did sign. Okay, so they all like to say it was a bipartisan bill signed by President Trump. Well, yeah, it's a very bad law that requires the beneficial owner to file. That is, the beneficial owner of any type of entity filed with the Secretary of State. That would be a corporation, a limited partnership, a limited liability company. That beneficial owner, defined as someone who owns 25% or more, or who has substantial control, whatever that means. You're a manager, there are lots of gray areas there. But the
Right.
bottom
That's
line is,
intentional, right?
oh
They
yeah, oh
put that
yeah,
in there so it's open-ended and they can argue against
so
what
true.
control means, right? If it was
That-
black and white, then they couldn't get as many people.
yeah, exactly right.
Right.
So that beneficial owner is required under the Corporate Transparency Act and the ensuing regulations to file what is called a beneficial owner information report, also called a BOIR. Now, the law had been challenged in court many times. One court found it unconstitutional. Another court in Oregon found it constitutional. Then there was another case in which it was again found unconstitutional. And that was in early December. The deadline to file, by the way, was December 31st of this year. And so just on the eve of that deadline, a federal judge ruled unconstitutional. Nobody has to file. The administration came back and said they challenged it, and a panel in the Fifth Circuit said, no, you are going to have to file. And so it was on again. And so, as you say, off, on again, off again, on again, off again. Then it went to another panel of the Fifth Circuit, which ruled no, on the merits, it is unconstitutional. We think it's a preliminary injunction, which means it's not a final ruling. It's just a first look at the case. So it went off again. And the bottom line was, as we speak right now, nobody has to file their BOIR report. Nobody has to file it because the Fifth Circuit will hear oral arguments on it on March 25th of this year, and we'll get some kind of a ruling later in the year. Now, my guess is that this administration will probably not try to enforce it. I'm hoping that'll be the case. It may be one of the regulations that they get rid of. That's the hope. But it's a very bad law because it's ineffective. It's not going to accomplish what it was designed to do. And that was designed to try to find bad guys who are hiding behind LLCs, who are doing drugs, drug trafficking, money laundering, and things like that. There were so many exemptions to it. Any enterprise with $20 million or $5 million or more, or 20 more employees didn't have to file. Well, any drug organization can easily, be an exempt organization. So
Right.
bottom line is just a very badly conceived law, and I hope it goes away.
So what happens to those people that actually filed those reports? Are they exposed at all by
No.
showing what they showed, or is that sitting in a computer someplace?
Well, it is sitting in a computer someplace, but it's in a government database and it is not publicly searchable. Now, we all know databases can be hacked, and then that information can be made public, or can end up on the dark web. So people would prefer not to have ever filed in the first place, but at least it's not publicly searchable the way many databases are. And, if the law goes away, the hope is they'll just delete the files, and there we go. But I don't think if you were set up with a structure to give you anonymity, it didn't destroy your anonymity, because once again, this information went into private databases.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Was there ever, do you think, some sort of nefarious angle that the government was looking for? So once they have access to people's information, they can do some things right behind the scenes. Like, we like to believe that the government's, be the lookout for our best interests, but
Mm-hmm.
was there rumors at all that the government was going to use it for not its intended purpose?
Well, it depends on who you talk to,
Right.
because the government's stated purpose was to try to stop bad guys who are hiding behind LLCs and other types of entities. There are those who believed that the government, was trying to collect all this information. But in reality, that information's all out there anyway. We all file tax returns with way more private information on it than the BOIR ever had. So all the information was already out there. All the BOIR did was it collected it in one place and made it all, kind of wrapped it up in a bow, if you will. So the bottom line is people of a certain persuasion would think that, look, this is the way the government's going to use it. If you voted wrong, if you contribute to the wrong political party, the other side can come after you because you didn't, file your BOIR on time. The penalties were pretty stiff. Adjusted for inflation, you could be fined $591 per day of not filing. And of course, you had to file within 90 days of creating a new entity. And what's even worse is the law stated that you had to file within 30 days of a change. So you change your address, now you got to file within 30 days. And, these fines could be really, really significant. And if somebody says, well, I'm just not going to file, willful refusal to file could result in a felony conviction and jail time. So
it's conceivable that if in March, when they go and they review this, that they could say, okay, this is legitimate. We're going to move forward with it. And by the way, there's a bunch of people who didn't file by the end of the year last year.
Yeah.
They could all be incurring daily fines right now.
No, I think if that no one should lose any sleep over that, because if they do rule that it is, and it may ultimately go to the U.S. Supreme Court, maybe. But if they do rule that it is constitutional and everybody does have to comply, then there will be new filing deadlines created so everyone can have a chance to comply.
There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was an absolute mess.
It is.
You didn't hear about it through mainstream media much, but I would see it all the time in my social media feeds.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the alternative news place, right? There was a lot of people talking about this. But you didn't hear it much from, Fox or CNN or these other news channels, which was interesting.
Yeah. And maybe one of the reasons is because it only applied to small business owners, of which there are about 33 million in the U.S. And maybe the major media just didn't think it was broadly applicable enough that people would care. Certainly small business owners cared. And we would send periodic notices out to our database of clients to, inform them what's going on with the Corporate Transparency Act. What are your obligations?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. They always say that, small business, is the core of our economy. It's the core of the, American dream is small business, right? So, some people were very interested in it. It just didn't seem like it got enough of a spotlight. Mm-hmm. But we'll see how that plays out. But in your in all the years you've been doing this, you've been on both sides of some of these lawsuits, and and you've kind of transitioned now into something where you can help people more. But through your experience, what are some like the biggest misconceptions people have about how the legal system actually works?
Well, I'll tell you, I had a misconception when I went into law as a young lawyer that truth, justice in the American way, is going to always prevail, and always the right party. I mean, the party who was in the right would always win at trial. And, my experience with what I told you about my story, it proved that to be completely wrong. So it is not necessarily, just because you're right, because you have the law and you have the facts on your side, that you're going to prevail. What will help you prevail is maintaining your entities, complying with corporate formalities. And what that nebulous term means is having minutes, having full documentation, having resolutions, documenting major decisions. And then whenever you enter into any kind of an agreement with someone else, document it, write it out. You should have a lawyer draft it for you, but at the very least, you ought to have at least a memorandum. Benson, sending you an email today, we talked about, an agreement that we're going to go into business together and we're and at least you have an email of some kind that would document what you talked about. So, so very, very important to stay on the right side. Once again, the biggest takeaway is take your entities seriously, because once again, the attitude of the court will be, if you didn't take your entity seriously, why should this court? And if you
Right.
didn't, they will disregard the existence of the entity and pierce the corporate veil.
Yeah. So when it comes to, an agreement, like an enforceable agreement, something that will hold up in court, like you said, to just document, even if it's an email, but there's stuff that's more ironclad than that, right? It's kind of like this spectrum of validity,
Right.
right? Starting with like, a duly signed and executed agreement that has real ink on it, right? And then it starts to go down from there to, oh, we have a verbal agreement. We've got a
Mm.
handshake agreement. Like,
Yeah.
what's really enforceable? I mean, can you enforce, someone's word? How do you
No.
prove that?
And you can't. An oral agreement is unenforceable. So you're exactly right in thinking of a gradation. The gold standard is an enforceable agreement is a written agreement signed by both parties. Going down the list, that email memorandum is at least evidence that we had some kind of an agreement. Is that necessarily enforceable? No, because it's not signed by anybody. It's just some evidence that we talked about this, and you'd have to use some other means to establish, what the agreement really is, if there is any kind of written agreement. And then, as you say, you're exactly right. An oral agreement, completely unenforceable, which is why well-written documents that are contracts between two people will say this is the entire agreement between the parties. There are no other understandings, oral agreements, memoranda, anything that would supersede this. This is the agreement. So in other words, it's the four corners of the document that is the deal.
Yeah. And then you get into, there's agreements that are this thick, and
Yeah.
you got the one pagers that
Hmm.
people sign, right? Because it's easy to thinking that it's going to be, protectable. Like, what would you say about that? Like, is it better just to push as much legal jargon into a complex agreement so that you can protect all the angles, or is it better to simplify it in some cases?
Well, it is better to simplify it in some cases, because if it's a simple deal, you don't need an agreement like this thick. If it's a relatively simple deal, then keep it as simple and yet as comprehensive as you can. It's always the ability of the client to understand the contract, the ability to pay for the contract. The clients will often say, do a quick and dirty agreement for us. Well, okay. But the reason that these thick, agreements exist is because the parties are trying to anticipate, what if this happens? What if this happens? We're going to define this term. We don't want to leave any gray areas, because those are the areas of disagreement, which ultimately can turn into litigation. So
Right.
if you want to really nail it down, you're going to have to define the terms. You're going to have to define exactly what we mean and try not to leave gray areas.
Yeah, and a lot of those, the clauses and the way that contracts get thicker is because there's precedent, right?
Hmm.
So there's something happened in the past when they're like, okay, we're going to prevent that from happening again, and so now there's a new clause,
That's
right?
right.
But a lot of stuff hasn't happened yet, and we're moving into a whole new world with uh, AI,
Oh, wow.
right? And there's just so much we don't know about that. And so I'm not sure if you have any opinion on the kind of lawsuits that we're going to start seeing because of the use of AI and Chat GPT and all these other systems. Have you delved into that at all?
Well, yes, and there are lawsuits there. And another part of this brave new world, Benson, is driverless cars.
Mm,
And there is no law as to who's at fault. What if the software failed? What about this? What about that? That's a completely unmapped area, uncharted waters that we're going to be entering into with, you know, um, driverless cars. we're going to have drones delivering things. What happens if the drone causes damage? Whose fault was it?
Hmm.
Once again, all those laws are going to have to be written. Um, you know, all these, as you said, AI is it's presenting copyright issues. It's presenting probably patent issues. I haven't read anything about it yet, but I could conceive of that. Um, Possibly trademark issues. By the way, we set up a lot of businesses for clients, and a lot of people just agonize over what should I name my LLC. And the name has to be available in the state database. So if you're setting it up in, say, Colorado, no one else in Colorado would have that name if it's available.
Hmm.
Well, but people agonize over it. What am I going to call this LLC? I want to think of some really great name. I just had a client today who went to DeepSeek and and said, find a name for my company. And boop, it popped out. And now they've got a name for the company and they didn't have to worry about it. So they're using AI to name their companies.
I mean, that's a smart thing to do. Obviously, it
Yeah.
has to be available.
Yeah.
Actually, you could probably even ask the AI, only give me names that are available, right? Because they
Mm.
could search I don't know, is it the trademark office? What do they search? I guess the Secretary of
Oh,
State,
yeah,
right?
that's one. Yeah. Be the Secretary of State in the business department. Yeah.
Right. So only give me names that aren't already being used or
Mhm.
derivatives thereof, right? Right. Maybe add another word in there to get the same sort of vibe that you were going for in the first place.
That's right.
That's smart. I mean, there's so many good applications for AI. What's the use of AI in the legal world for
Well,
for
certainly
contract creation and
right in
evaluating a
drafting.
contract to see if there's holes and
Hmm.
you know, have you used any of that, or what are the applications of AI
Oh,
in the
yes.
legal world?
Yes, we use AI already, and especially in drafting contracts because, um, for example, if you are looking for a more defined phrase, I mean, you could have a clause that's, a few lines long, or you could have a clause that's this long in order to, make sure you're getting rid of the gray areas. So we can use AI to say, review this contract, what is missing, what should we strengthen, etc. I have a friend who's a tax lawyer who is training AI to review tax returns and using it in that way. So a lot of yet to be discovered uses for AI.
Oh yeah. Well, there's like these general platforms like, Chat GPT, and
Mhm.
I use one called Perplexity. And are there any out there right now that are designed for law that
Oh
you know
yeah.
of?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
One is called Spellbook. That's once again a contract drafting uh,
Mm.
application. And since that's my area of law, that's what I'm aware of. I'm sure there are lots of other applications in other areas. Yeah.
So do you see that AI is one of those places that's going to maybe jeopardize the careers of lawyers in the near future, where they won't need to get a lawyer because they feel like AI can handle it? Is that something that's people are thinking about?
Well, that's kind of a fool's errand because
Mm.
AI can provide certain language. It can make suggestions, but ultimately AI doesn't have the experience and the judgment to counsel people. That'd be interesting to know if AI could be sued for practicing law without a license. How's that?
That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah,
Yeah, who do
yeah.
you sue?
I don't think AI is going to necessarily put lawyers out of business. It's going to make lawyers work more efficient.
Yeah, I think that's the case too, because there's just so much gray area, so much subtlety.
Hmm.
You talked about the experience of, the lawyers in a trial. Like there's an art of going back and forth and taking what's said with somebody and like coming with a retort immediately,
You're
right? And
right.
going back and forth with people when they're on the stand
Hmm.
is something that you don't have time for AI to work through that, right?
That's
It
right.
it isn't something they can just work on the side. Like it's happening in real time in a lot of cases.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know, very interesting. I didn't even intend on talking about this when we just went down this path, but it's interesting
It
because
is.
AI is changing everything, and it's going to change the way that, real estate investors find deals, analyze deals. Obviously, with the complexities of the legal world, AI fits perfectly into that because it can analyze the world of every prior case out there, right? And look at all the precedent and find, risks. You can find opportunities, and to better prepare the lawyers so they can go in and set up a better case.
Yeah. And AI is also good at summarizing. I don't know how good at summarizing, but if you've got a case that's 50 pages long and you ask AI, summarize this case for me, that can save a lot of time. If assuming you can trust AI to get the real salient points.
Right. Yeah, because there's like these legal aids, right? There's 20 legal aids for every one, good attorney, right? And they're the
Hmm.
ones that doing all the dirty work.
Hmm.
But, you might be able to trim some fat with an AI aid.
Let's hope.
Yeah. Um, so, we're getting up toward the end of the hour here. And so just I want to loop it back to, what we're here for. And so wealth preservation, tax benefits, protecting yourself from lawsuits, right? Making sure that you're not getting sued. This is really where the core of your business lies. Um, can you talk of any cases right now where that just makes it really evident that, like, if you don't do things the right way, here's the poster child of what could happen to you?
Yes, there are a lot of those cases. That's what makes up the law books, of somebody, failing to do something that they should have done. I'll give you an example in really broad terms without getting into a lot of detail.
Hmm.
There was a couple who wanted to do a deal with another couple, best friends. See any red flags yet?
Yeah,
Yeah.
handshake agreement,
Uh-huh. That's
right?
what happened. No documentation whatsoever about what the agreement was. So this couple remembered the agreement this way, of course, in their favor, and the other couple remembered the agreement to be completely different in their favor. And they ended up butting heads and losing their friendship. And that all could have been avoided with good documentation. It could have been avoided with a good contract between the two of them. But even short of a contract, even just saying, today we talked about such and such and such, we agreed on such and such, that would have been not binding, but it would have been at least some evidence in the absence of a real agreement. So the more you can document and then turn it into an actual contract between the two parties, the better off you are. Because once again, oral agreements are unenforceable.
Yeah. So we're getting ready to go into tax season, right? So a
Hmm.
lot of people are thinking about taxes right now, and you've helped hundreds of people, maybe thousands, lower their tax liability legally. What's
Hmm.
one of the simplest tax strategies that most people don't know of that they could take advantage of?
Oh, wow. There are loads of deductions that, our tax laws say we can pay our taxes three different ways. We can pay our taxes now, can pay our taxes later, and sometimes we can pay our taxes never. And the way that works is if you are receiving a wage, an income, you're paying taxes right now. Every paycheck, they're withholding taxes.
Hmm.
You can pay taxes later when you can defer taxes in some kind of a 401k or IRA or some other tax deferred plan, 403b. You can also pay taxes later if you're doing a 1031 tax-free exchange. Tax deferred exchange is the more proper term. You're avoiding having to pay the capital gains tax and deferring the capital gains tax until a later date. And you can also pay taxes never when you take what is called a tax deduction. And there are many, many tax deductions, hundreds of deductions available to business owners, which are not available to W-2 employees. So when you have a business, the world of deductions opens up to you, and you are able to take deductions. So just to get very specific, there's a home office deduction, assuming you're working from home. Is the home mortgage interest deduction. That's available to almost anybody, even a W-2 employee. Of course, there's the standard deduction, which has been raised significantly. So it meant that a lot of people no longer itemize deductions whereas they used to. Basically, only business owners at this point itemize deductions. There are mileage deductions for travel that you can do. There's bonus depreciation for purchasing certain types of assets. There's Section 179 equipment deductions. You're buying equipment for your business. You can write it off. Medical deductions in many cases, and it goes on and on and on. Travel, you can write off travel if you're on business travel. So many types of deductions, which can significantly reduce the amount of income tax that you're going to have to pay.
And H&R Block knows about all of these, right?
Well, they should, and they probably do. Their software knows about it. Let's put it that way.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Well, we talked about a lot of things today, Bob, and I think ultimately the takeaway from this discussion is that you want to set things up right from the get-go. And so, if anybody is thinking about starting a company, or they're thinking about starting, maybe transitioning into a new space, how can they get a hold of you or somebody on your team?
Well, they could call our office, which is 945-542-7738, or they could go to our website, which would be info@assetdefenseteam.com. And you could, fill out a little form and indicate you'd like us to give you a call, and we'll be happy to do so.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate you coming on and giving us a little bit of insight into how you got started and, some little stories and anecdotes here and there. But I think this was very informational. So I thank you for taking the time.
You bet. Thank you, Benson.
And everybody, thanks for listening to this edition of the REI Hacker Podcast. Keep an eye out for more amazing guests like Bob Bluhm, and where we talk about business and real estate and investing and all things entrepreneurial. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you guys next time. Take care.